This is the Coaching Leader Podcast, a podcast about coaching, leadership, and leading through coaching. And here's your host, Scott Gress.
Welcome to the Coaching Leader. Today we're welcoming Reggie McNeal for the second part of our interview with him. He's a pastor, a church planter, a denominational executive, a leadership coach, author of 10 books, numerous articles, speaking engagements, blogs, podcasts. He's a senior fellow at Leadership Network. And in this second part, Reggie talks about the critical need for customized people development, the shifts we need to make and why, and gives some inspiring examples to guide us and encourage us. And if you happen to miss the first part of this interview, I invite you to go back to episode 47 of The Coaching Leader and check out his description of church-centric versus kingdom-centric ministry and leadership. You can reach out to him at his website, reggiemcneal.org, or you can contact us at scottgress.com. And now here's the second part of our interview with Reggie McNeal.
But I wonder if we could kind of shift the conversation. You know, we mentioned the priesthood of believers, and you talked about developing people, and it seems to me that those two, being kingdom-centric and developing people, kind of go together.
Absolutely.
What do you mean by people development, and how do we move towards that, away from what we've kind of done all along?
Well, there's some key shifts we've got to make here. You know, one of the things we ought to know, and I'll just hit the big ones. I mean, there's a bunch, but you know, this idea of teaching, didactic. Just explaining stuff to people, propositional truth, with the idea that that's personally transforming. We've got to question that. It's not, it's not that teaching is unimportant, and because Jesus certainly did a lot of that. But a classroom model for discipleship, I don't think he adopted that approach.
Isn't that supposed to trickle down to our behaviors?
Yeah, right. I mean, a focus, I was talking, Jesus had us, it's the difference between having, it's having an obedience-based discipleship, because Jesus always was follow me, do this, do that. I mean, this was not left to our interpretation or even, to our deciding whether or not it ought to be on our agenda or not. He was pretty plain about, here's what you do. And our job is to be obedient to that. I mean, if we're going to create transformational environments, like you've talked about, transformed lives, then it has to be obedience-based. Like, what is God telling you to do, and what are you doing about it? I mean, let me tell you, those two questions don't get old. Because those are pretty fresh. The assumption is that you're in touch with God and you're getting some instruction from Jesus or the Spirit, however you, and then, and so what? And that requires more of a coaching, debriefing environment as opposed to a didactic delivery. It's more debriefing.
And they own their own insight, and they'll be much more engaged in wanting to follow through with a coaching kind of way.
And if I could just say, we've assumed that if people had right information, that they would then, turn that into behaviors that would reflect the reality of that and the implications of that. But I mean, we've never had a more, here's the example. I mean, we've never had a more nutritionally aware group of Americans. I mean, I can read the side panel of cereal boxes and soup cans with some fair degree of understanding about carbohydrates and sugars and fats and all that stuff. But I still reach for the Krispy Kremes, instead of the pine bark or whatever it is I'm supposed to have for breakfast. And I mean, it doesn't, information by itself doesn't shift behavior. We have to create an environment. I remember taking a group, if I can say one more, I don't, because you have a question, I'm just trouncing over you.
Go for it.
No, I took a group of church leaders to an Xbox. Now, I don't do that Xbox stuff. That looks like torture to me. But I took them there because people's lives are transformed there. And I asked the coach who was there, and they're coaches. They're not just leaders; they're coaches. And I asked him to talk about the key elements of an Xbox that created a transformational environment. And then with the idea that the church folks could say, oh, and it's stuff like accountability, goal setting, encouragement. Nobody's by themselves here. Everybody's got a partner. And the partner's job is to encourage the other, not to, you can do it, not slap them on you didn't do it. I mean, there are a whole bunch of these kinds of elements.
Are you talking about the exercise place?
Right.
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. I'm talking about the exercise place. I should have been. Yeah. Isn't it an Xbox?
CrossFit?
I guess Xbox is also a video.
You're talking CrossFit. CrossFit.
Yeah, CrossFit. That's it.
Yeah, okay.
CrossFit box.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You should back it up and tell the whole story now. And again, sorry about that. It shows you, how with it I am.
But the guy is customized, working a customized approach with each of those CrossFit participants.
Yes. Yeah. And it starts with, what do you want to accomplish in here? Mm-hmm. It's not like someone walks into a CrossFit box and this guy says, I figured it out for you. Here's your thing. Here, do all this stuff. I mean, how crazy. It's, what are your goals? What would you like? So, I mean, why wouldn't we have environments where people are able to talk about their lives and say, this is what I need God to do, or I would like to see God do in my life over the next 6 months. Can you help me? And then actually see how it's going. I mean,
yeah, as opposed to, it's almost a knee-jerk default thinking. Well, we'll invite them to the next Sunday school series, where we'll cast the net real wide, and we'll grab an audience and sit them in a classroom, as opposed to what is really turns into a one-on-one, a lot more work, but doggone it, a lot more productive, speaking to people, working with them as individuals. But that puts a whole shift on what we think of in terms of the work of a pastor or the work of church staff. Instead of managing the program or the class, you're talking about working individually with leaders to develop other leaders to work and apprentice followers.
Yeah. And it's not all one-on-one, but it is individual in the sense of customization.
Okay.
Because I mean, what I work with all my folks when I do hand-to-hand combat with congregations, how can we turn each small group experience into a coaching experience? I mean, I'm not against curriculum. I've written some curriculum, probably the best stuff's ever been written. If only I would do it, I mean, but don't hold me, accountable to what I just wrote. And, but I mean, so how are you having coaching conversations, in those settings? Every Sunday school class, I mean, most Sunday school classes, it's just a information transfer. There's a, time for prayer where everybody rehearses stuff that's, comfortable about illness and stuff like that. But no, I mean, I'm talking about nitty gritty. And this is why I'm seeing many more micro church expressions where people are journeying through life with very few people in terms of intentional, this kind of intentionality. I mean, you can only support so much, I mean, in the larger setting, and don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that larger settings are inappropriate. I mean, large gatherings, I mean, of course they are, but if there's not some vehicle or structure there that allows for the kinds of conversations that you and I are talking about, then all you're doing is putting on another show for spectators and consumers, and thinking that you're really accomplishing something.
In one of your books, you talk about people development scorecard, and maybe that's a for their maturity. I imagine. What do you exactly mean by that, or what would such a scorecard include?
Would be interesting, wouldn't it, if we actually let people design that? Most people have a feel for what they'd like to see happen in their lives. What may be a concern to me may not be a concern to you, but if we're put in a setting where we think everybody's concerned, we have the sermon series plotted out for 6 weeks and all the programming supports that, and we know this is what God wants to do in your life over the next 6 weeks. That may or may not be true. And besides the fact that, do we need to turn church people into church people first in order to develop them? And I'm suggesting no, we engage people right where they already are, and we don't require that they become members of the club in order to have an influence and an impact on their life. But I'm thinking, when I talk about scorecard, and by the way, that some people don't like that term. So what I'm talking about here really is, what do you celebrate? I mean, what's important and what do you celebrate? Because that's what gets done. So, it could be that my scorecard is, that I'd have a better relationship with my kids, and better marital relationship, or I'd have a better outlook on life, or I would get a job, or I would move up. And I mean, this is real life. This is where people's life. Well, why wouldn't we then say, well, how's that working? And what could we bring to bear on that? What would help you have a better relationship with your kids? How can you do it? And that opens up a whole, and then that we have the technology now with the digital revolution. People can get access to help if we can help them frame the questions and help them know the switchbacks that'll get you up the mountain here, instead of looking at the whole mountain, say, I can't get up through that. But, there's a trail, you can figure this out, and then you have resources that are available to people, gosh, at 3 a.m. if that's when they're really working on something. I mean, it is so available now to us, and people can report their own progress. I mean, you just have to ask them. I mean, when I tell people, I ask pastors sometimes, how many better marriages do you have in your church than you had last year? How many, and certainly coming out of COVID, how many people here are struggling with mental health issues and depression, anxiety? Why don't we know that? Pastors look at me, we don't know that. We don't ask that. Well, why don't we ask that? Because that's where people are living. But that would require a whole different, that you would begin then to take that information seriously, and then you begin to address that. I mean, imagine if 40% of your congregation, or 25% of whatever, on some kind of feedback loop, told you that they were concerned about some aspect of mental health. Well, you don't have to go on a vision quest or smoke peyote to figure out what the next focus of your messages are going to be. I mean, what if you were actually informed by your congregation and the people around you about what is interesting and not interesting, but what's needed by them? I mean, I just think we just spend so much time creating artificially creating resources and then trying to figure out how to market them to church people. It's just craziness. It's craziness.
See if it'll throw against the wall, see if it'll stick, as opposed to.
Well, yeah. And how can we make this more exciting? I mean, we're on a treadmill of activity that just doesn't produce what really gives us life. And, you made a comment earlier, Scott, you said burnout and stuff. I mean, if we were, the kingdom gives life, and that ought to be a tip to us. The burnout that we're experiencing in professional church life right now ought to be a huge wake-up call that, this stuff we're involved in, a church-centric approach and a church-centric, life is not going to sustain you. It actually beats you up. Well, that's not God's design for your life. I mean, for crying out loud. But everybody that I know who's focusing on kingdom and is able to make these shifts and is working toward these, they're jazzed, they have energy, in spite of, they have that in spite of energy that the kingdom brings.
Yeah. Oh, so many wonderful things. You talk about the idea of membership being more fluid, that it's not about that. It's about actually talking to people and finding out where they're at and what their needs are, what they're concerned about, and saying, hey, how can I support you? As we kind of draw things to a close, do you have maybe a story of some of the people you've worked with or two that kind of illustrates this kingdom shift and people development shift that would be helpful for us to kind of get real concrete here?
Well, let me pull on a story. I'll tell you what came to mind. Okay. And if it doesn't do it, you can edit this and find a better deal. But I had an invitation to go to India a few years ago. I've been more than once now, but the invitation was from a guy there. And I don't want to use a name or a locale right now because the government of India has become increasingly non-helpful and problematic for Christian groups. But his invitation was for me to come speak to a group of pastors. He said, but what I really want you to see is this stuff you talk about really works. I didn't know what he meant, but I was willing to go. And a former student of mine at Fuller had hooked me up with this. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So I said yes. So I went. I was met by, as I got off the van, by over 200 orphans that, lined the way, clapping and singing. And I mean, it's very humbling.
Moving, yeah.
Most of these orphans were not without parents. It's that their parents had brought them to this place of help because this place could do more for them than they could give their children. The next day I visited the school, 3 layers of school, elementary, all the way up through college, 900 high schoolers, fully accredited with religious or spiritual instruction as part of the experience, a community college training nurses and computer software folks, the microeconomic center where they were, helping farmers know how to grow better and then the micro loans, the coffee plantation that employed 70 people. As the leader said, I like coffee, but we do this because this is 70 jobs. And then the print shop that we dedicated with mostly jobs for women, 25 more jobs to print material, by the way, for the 975,000 kids in this organization's backyard Bible clubs, all in these villages all over India. I haven't even told you about the hospital. The hospice. I mean, all of this is going on. And by the way, church planting as well, over 40,000 village church expressions, and by the way, I went to one of these where we dedicated a building, but it's not a church building. It's called a life center. I mean, how smart is this? How smart is this? Can we just take all our church names off and just say, Holy Trinity Life Center? And I mean, so all of this is to say, I saw in that 10-day experience a leader and people around them that take seriously what it means for the kingdom of God to come on earth. Because I don't know if you've been, but Hinduism, it's a very dark religion. Obviously, it's a dark place. And it just shows what light the kingdom brings. Happiest people I've been around, pastors who slept on the ground for 3 days, for in here. I mean, it's just, now some of your listeners may be saying, well, that's great. That's India. How about here? I can tell you that, Godfrey there in Houston that's delivering 2,000 backpacks of 6 pounds each food on Friday for 1,900 kids, so they have food to get through the weekend. I can tell you a literacy coalition in right south of San Francisco in the Mid-Peninsula area. It's helping kids learn to read so they're not trapped. It's just the school to jail pipeline. I could talk to you about, many, many more that are, or go to Dallas, visit Life in Deep Ellum. They have had the courage to put Life on their church, their non-church building. And, you go in and you smell the coffee. It's a really great coffee shop. It's a 7-day-a-week operation. It's not a Sunday gathering place that there's an art gallery there. It's not all Sunday school art, but it's local to support local artists. There's a music venues place that's used throughout the week for bands and on Sunday for gathering of believers, shared office space. It's something that reflects the whole community. It's not an existence separate from the community. It reflects the whole community. It's arts community and all that's bubbling out of the eateries and all that. So I guess those are some examples that come to mind. When the kingdom breaks in, it brings life, and that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. As I'm listening to you, I'm reminded that people development that we're talking about best or most fruitfully occurs within the context of some kind of activity or service or ministry, rather than just artificially in a classroom. Because when they're serving somebody or blessing somebody and they get into it, they want to grow closer to God, who can empower them to do that work.
Absolutely.
They want to do it well.
Absolutely. I remember I visited it was an Episcopal congregation, and a few people got it the weekend that I was there, and one of them is a school teacher, middle school, who said, I need some help, mentors, math, science. Well, not that many people feel qualified to do that, but a year later I was back to see how, and I just happened to ask how that was going. I was meeting with their vestry, and they said, oh, we've got 8 people doing that. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but the size of this congregation and, the bandwidth of folks that could do science, I mean, basically all the early adopters had jumped in and they were helping.
Yeah. Awesome.
And so I said, well, how's it going? And the pastor says, well, tell him, Frank, and Frank shakes his head no. And so Susan says, well, I'll tell you. He took a kid that was failing 8th grade, and he not only did he pass 8th grade, but he's knocking the ball out of the park in 9th grade. And I said, hey, what did you do with this kid? He's again shaking his head. And I said, no, come on, give it. Let us know. We need to. He said, well, I meet with him every Monday morning. We have breakfast. I make sure he's got what he needs. I mean, he's downplaying the whole thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I said, well, what you're doing for this kid is just, you're changing the trajectory of his life. By now, big old tears are coming down Frank's cheeks. He said, no, what this kid's doing for me is way more than I'm doing for him. That's the kingdom, baby.
Absolutely.
That's God's way of, as we serve, we grow, we live. And wouldn't it be just like God to do it that way?
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for your generous time. And I'm assuming the best way to contact you is probably your website, ReggieMcNeal.com.
.org.
.org. Okay.
Would be, although go to .com and see what you can find. I'm told I own that one too, but maybe I should. But anyway, yeah, just ReggieMcNeal.org. Or, you can email, and my email and cell number and all that's on there. That'd be great.
Well,
Love to hear from folks. Sure.
Thank you so much. And
glad to be with you.
God bless you.
You too, Scott. Bye-bye.
Well, sincere thanks to Reggie McNeal for sharing his time and wisdom and his influence on my ministry and so many others. If you'd like more than just a podcast or a book, reach out to Reggie at his website, reggiemcneal.org. Or for personal coaching for yourself, for your team, or your organization, reach out to us at scottgress.com. Well, thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking with you next time on The Coaching Leader.